I'm so excited to welcome you to the Writer Center Virtual Craft Chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Jennifer Long with us as tonight's guest. Jennifer, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you. We are so excited to chat. Before we really dive in, would you mind reading a couple poems from Return Flight for us? And then we can dive into the nitty gritty.
Sure. Um, yeah, it's been maybe a few months since I read from this book, so it was nice to kind of come back with fresh eyes and to think about what I wanted to read. So I'll read two poems. The first is called Drift. I wanted this poem to be about dropping textbooks on my arm to get out of practicing violin, to be about grandfather hitting mom and how decades later I could still feel the sting, about ancestors changing their last name to Guang. But instead, this poem wants to be about dad's beat face when he has exactly one drink, how outside of a Paris cafe, glasses of wine in hand, brother and I glow like that one Van Gogh painting. It wants to be about mom wafting prayers as she stirs ribs and radishes and cauliflower in a pot for hours. The poem becomes the prayers, and the prayers become my body. The body, I notice, plays a symphony, the stomach grumbling, and becomes the act of crusting salmon with miso and putting it in the convection oven I got from a dear friend. The presence of beating hearts through objects passed down. Beanie Baby, moonstones, tarot deck, calendula oil, coffee grinder, cactus. It finally stretches to the south-facing window. And this next poem I'll read is called How to Love a Rock. Notice the maroon cirrus clouds against the gray of her landscape. Then each white spot, stars that propel you into space. Tell her what you see, how you love the way she smells like grass and salt. Ask about her properties, history, how she was picked from the glacial waters of Lake Crescent and brought across the land to be placed in your palms. Ask to feel her smooth, caress till your thumb can find a home in her brook. Be with her and share your day, how you jumped into a river, came out ice, how you worry now, let it go. Give her space to say not words, then when she's ready, many. Thank you.
Thank you. I know someone posted quietly snaps in the chat, so we'll audibly snap since I'm unmuted. I'm so glad that you read those poems, especially Drift, because I know that that's one that I had some lines of questioning about. So that is amazing to be able to hear the poem, and then we'll revisit it later. But before I ask maybe our toughest question, could you just tell us in your own words who you are?
Oh man.
Which is its own form of hard question, right?
Yeah, that is a hard question. Oh, who am I? Okay. um, well, I am a poet, a writer who hasn't really been writing because of burnout. I am also a gardener. I am also a person who likes to travel, to be in nature. I don't know. Yeah.
That's
I like
great.
music.
That's perfect. No,
Okay.
that gives us everything that we need to know. And maybe I'll ask a question about that writing practice and burnout later on too, because I think that's always something that's valuable to talk about. And I know I feel the same way. I'd much rather be spending time with other people's poems than my own right now. So we'll get there. But now to our real hardest question. What's something that you wish someone would ask you about your poems, or something that you've never really had the opportunity to talk about before?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a hard question. It's kind of like thinking about like what you don't know that you don't know. um, but I think one question that I'm interested in is how I've changed through writing this book, or what has changed through writing the book.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard that question asked of anyone, but I think it's really interesting to think about. A lot of times when we'll have these craft chats, we'll talk about the writing process and maybe how long it takes for a book to come out. And sort of implied in that is the idea that you're not the same person at the end of that book writing and publishing experience as you were when you started. So now maybe I'll turn the question on you. How do you think your writing, maybe not even style, but maybe practice or conceptualization of yourself as a poet has kind of changed?
Yeah. I think when I was working on this book, it was mostly in grad school at Michigan, though the ideas for this book came a lot earlier when I was in college. And then I took a little bit to work in New York. Yeah, so the ideas had been brewing for a while, and I think, yeah, I just had like my nose to the page a lot of the time about these ideas, and kind of, I think grad school also turned our eye towards like publishing and making it into a book. And I think, though I think that's useful, I've learned, I think, through publishing that it's not the most rewarding part of writing. And it also makes me come to the page in a bit of a different way. Yeah, so I think that that is how I've changed. Maybe I'm more reluctant to write now. Or like more careful with, yeah, more reluctant. I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm assuming this is maybe part of like a thesis project. So when you were writing these poems, you had sort of like that end point in mind, right? Do you find now that it's a little more challenging because there's not really that sort of benchmark, or is it maybe more freeing that you can kind of come and go and write as you see fit?
Yeah, I think it's harder now that there's no benchmark. And so the motivation has to really come from like me. Like it's not from any type of like achievement. I'm like, now it has to be like, I'm writing because this is really, I mean, not that like these poems are not like, I wasn't motivated to write them, but there was like other things. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
no,
harder to like access like a playfulness or curiosity
mm,
um, than it used to be, I think.
mhm. Yeah, I definitely felt that when I came out of my MFA program as well. And I think some of that is still kind of lagging with my writing process. I have the manuscript and it's like, well, now what? What, like, do I write just random poems? Like, what if they don't fit anywhere? And that sort of question, that what if of how to make it do something else, even if it like lives in a document on my Google Drive forever. And then I'm wondering, okay, well, how do I put it into something? How do I make it fit into something else? And yeah,
Mhm.
those things that are always churning at the back of our minds when we meet the blank page.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe now is a good time to talk about those moments in the poem that you read, Drift, where the speaker starts by saying, I wanted this poem to be about, but then there's that turn in the middle of the poem where it goes, but instead this poem wants to be about. I'm really interested in the sort of larger commentary on writing and poetry and how the poem can sort of have its own agency. So can you talk about your relationship to that idea, or and how that affects your writing process and approach to the page?
Yeah. So this poem, yeah. I think that sometimes, I guess from maybe I really see my poetry and writing practice as maybe a little bit spiritual, and maybe like a form of prayer in some ways. And so I think in that way, sometimes like the poem can take on its own life, and that like me as a writer, though, like I can like write a poem because I'm a person, like can write a poem, but sometimes you just kind of have this feeling that like, okay, so when I was writing this poem, I was like editing it and I was like, there's this feeling that no matter how hard I work this poem and try to edit it, it will not ever be like finished because I'm trying to move it in a direction that it doesn't really want to go, and that like maybe turning my eye towards something different will help it kind of like release, or like something different, like I guess like a magic moment or something where the poem can turn because that's what it wants to do. um I guess maybe a less spiritual way of looking at it would be like, this poem is not great, but gonna write this other poem that's related to it, but is yeah. But yeah, I think that's kind of what happened with this poem, where I was kind of like stuck in a mindset of, um, because it starts, I wanted this poem to be about dropping textbooks on my arm to get out of practicing violin. So it's about these experiences that the speaker was thinking about and having about the past, and past violences that they maybe experienced themselves or witnessed, which is a lot of what this book is about. But I think that this poem in particular wanted to turn an eye towards like what what is not violent, what is sweet, what is tender, what is working, what is loving. And so it kind of makes that turn there.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that pivot point, that volta, and then the way the poem sort of unfolds, having already been one way. I think sort of, I feel like that's a poem that maybe in like a workshop setting, people would be like, it kind of feels like two poems, right? But then you really want to embrace the poem being its differences, right? And I think that that poem does such a good job with sort of embracing its own meanderings and its own surprises.
Yeah, because yeah, both poems are still there, and like it's not like editing out what it's quote unquote not anymore, but letting both kind of like sit next to each other.
Mhm.
And so the reader can see that transformation too.
Yeah, oh, I love that. It's also making me think of the poem um, from the Taiwan Cypress in Alishan, which is sort of that contrapuntal visual form. So you have the two halves that you can kind of read separately, but then read them together.
Mhm.
I didn't specifically ask a question about this, but this is a good way to like lead us into form. Could you talk about that poem and that form in particular, and how you um, landed on that? And then we can move more generally into the other forms that you use in the book.
Yeah. Um, I don't think anyone has ever asked me about how I wrote this poem. um, yeah, but so the story about the poem is that I went to Taiwan with my dad, and we went on this tour in Alishan, and they talked about the trees there, and the history of the trees and how they're um, endangered now because of the ways that the Japanese had was like foresting, like overforesting. And so like thinking about history and kind of like yeah, the story just really spoke to me. And so the poem itself is kind of written from the perspective of the trees during that time, and that loss that they experience. Um, and so I wanted with the contrapuntal to kind of to because it ends up reading a little bit fractured.
Mm.
Um, and so I wanted that fracturedness to mirror kind of the fracturing of that place, um, and that experience, and kind of try to have multiple voices be possible, as you're talking about with the different kind of ways you can read it, as like these separate voices, but the voices also come together to say this
Mm.
one thing in the
Mhm.
end. Um, yeah.
Great. Yeah, I really like that. And thinking through trees and like root systems and that sort of intertwining, but also fractured nature of that too, I think is really interesting. Um, we love a form content sort of moment, right? Um, so that's great. And then, yeah, I do want to move to talk about some of the other forms here. There's haiku, tanka, sonnets, odes, puzzles. I mean, there's just, you do a lot in here. There's like the visual poems. So could you just talk through your relationship to form and received form overall? And then maybe at what point in the writing process do you decide to stick with a form or incorporate the form into the poem?
Hmm. Yeah. So I think I come to form through like a visual arts kind of angle because that's my background. And so when I came to poetry, I was interested in writing, but ways to incorporate writing with visual. And I think poetry does that very well. And so I think working with form, it's kind of like a set way to make a poem look pretty on the page in many ways. So that's a lot of the reason why I enjoy form, and also kind of I have a pretty like analytical mind. Like maybe like I do better when I do like tests, I do better on math sections than I do reading sections, which is kind of weird maybe as a writer. But I like form because it kind of like taps into like more math side of my brain. It feels like when I'm trying to get like the right rhyme or like the right meter, or like making um, or figuring out a way in a ghazal for those repeated words to really match. Yeah, I think in terms of when it comes into the writing process, I oftentimes will start with form as like a prompt. Maybe like with a subject in mind, like I want to write about this using this form, and then go from there. But I also think sometimes it comes naturally, like sometimes I'll write a poem. Um, I think for some reason sonnets, they feel like they just kind of like come to me. Or I'll just like write a short poem, maybe because I write shorter poems. I'll write a short poem and I'm like, oh, that's 14 lines. Maybe I should kind of like figure it into a sonnet.
Mm.
So yeah, I think sonnets are very interesting. And also thinking of like form as it relates to like history and kind of like other voices that you're speaking with when you're writing in form. I think that's also a beautiful tradition in poetry.
Yeah, that sort of conversation that the form creates over history. Yeah, love that.
Mhm.
And I find myself writing a lot of maybe accidental sonnets too. I'd be like, here's my poem. And then I go back and just kind of count. I'm like, oh man, 14 again. And then I'm like, how can I change this up?
Yeah, 14 is
Or
like the magic number.
right. Or, how can I either do something to break out of that sort of form or put it more in form, right? And like
Yeah.
not just have it be 14 lines as a sonnet, have it do something as part of that larger conversation, which is the hard part, right?
Yeah.
That comes
Yeah.
in revision. Um, Yeah, I love these moments in the ghazals where the words like are kind of sonically in tune, but it's kind of drifted a little bit away, like broken that repetition a little bit, like knife and the night one.
Mhm.
And I think that's a fun way to play with the form and keep it exciting for you as a writer as well.
Mhm.
Um, I also wanted to take a look at the longer sort of central poem layover, because this one has that moment of self erasure. And I'd love to talk about um, how you conceptualize incorporating that self erasure into that poem, and sort of what it means to erase your own words in a poem that's largely about sort of the tensions between language barriers and understanding, and being in a different place, and sort of reaching through all of those tensions.
Yeah. Yeah. I think with that poem in particular, I so with that section, I had written like I write a lot in the notes app on my phone, just kind of like stream of consciousness. And so I wrote this kind of like little prose thing um, about uh, my experience in Taiwan, what I was experiencing, and the trouble that I was having with language barrier, like talking to my relatives and also like toggling between like thinking in English and then trying to speak in Chinese, but having it be like not great because I have like a fifth grade level, like speaking level of Chinese. So like not being able to express myself. And so like writing and like doing that stream of consciousness in my notes was the way that I could fully express myself and have someone, aka me, understand what was going on. Um, and so when I looked back at that note and decided to put it into this poem, like I was thinking about, like this poem is about feeling constricted because I have to edit myself when I talk, or like think on like two levels. And so what happens if I like enact that even more like as a future self with past self, doing that, which might be some kind of like maybe like a silencing of the past self, but also kind of like it could also be seen as like editing to make something different or like differently beautiful. And so I kind of enjoy or appreciate that kind of space of like it can be seen in these two ways, just kind of depending on how you're looking at it. And both ways I think kind of match with the tensions that you're talking about with this poem in particular, which also talks about like being a part of the Taiwanese diaspora and feeling like my role in that maybe, or like how I relate to my Taiwanese heritage and how it's a little bit complicated for me.
Yeah, I love what you were saying about erasure as a way to make something different and more beautiful too. Like it's not just an act of taking away, but it also creates something that in this poem has its own meaning and its own life away from that notes app, and is also a way to sort of work through those tensions and those um, emotions as well.
Mm.
And I think this poem is so central, well, physically central in the collection, but also it just touches on so many of the themes, the sort of like the family tensions that you were mentioning, home. There's a lot of the food, hunger, which also plays into like desire and touch. So could you talk about just how you sort of navigated those themes in this poem and then across the collection? And maybe this is a good place to talk about like organizing the collection itself.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm kind of excited to talk about organizing the collection.
Yes.
But I think for this poem in particular, it was, well, I think because I had all these poems. So this poem was written kind of like later in the writing process. I was like looking at the inventory of all these poems I had, and I was like, I am missing something that kind of ties all these themes together. They feel very related to me, but I'm not sure if a reader might be able to like make these ties just with what's here. And so that's what really began this poem, as kind of like, yeah, like writing the missing piece to this collection. And it just kind of like came out very quickly as well, which surprised me. But I also love when that happens. Yeah. And then, so for organizing the collection, I had kind of this Word document of just the titles of all the poems. And then I would write next to them what themes each, I guess I would first identify the different themes that are in the collection. And then next to each poem, I would write like, this one specifically touches upon this, this, this. I would go down the list and keep doing that. And so at the end, I would have this document where I could see for each section, like what, like to make sure that the different themes are kind of like kaleidoscoping together in a way that feels whole, and that each section had kind of like a narrative arc to it. Yeah, I think, yeah, yes.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's really helpful too when thinking of putting together poems, because there's so many different ways. I think the organization of a collection is really daunting for a lot of people. And you can print them all out and lay them on your floor and do that. And I always find myself going back to my manuscript and being like, well, what if I put it in a different order? What if I did something totally different? And I like that idea of sort of distilling the poems to their core themes and then seeing how it ebbs and flows throughout the collection. And I definitely felt that and felt that sort of bridging. And I love that bridging happens in the poem called Layover, right? Because it's sort of this kind of liminal space where you're just kind of hanging out. And I love that that language of movement and sort of, flight, if we want to go back to the title of the collection, but that sort of transience in the language itself of the poem titles. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, coming up with that sort of framework, the, departure, we have turbulence, layover, drift, the opening poem, neighborhood walk. And so there's a lot of movement in the titles, and it's not always forward movement. It's not always intentional movement. So I wonder if you could talk about how that is working as a sort of architecture for the collection as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of these poems had different names before I titled the collection Return Flight. And the title came like last. It was the last thing. Like basically last. But once I had the title, I was like, okay, I think it feels complete now. I think all along I knew that I wanted the title to be related to airplanes, because that's just like, I was thinking about how traveling from the US to Taiwan, it's like a long, almost 24-hour flight. And so it's kind of like that weird space, and I wanted to like make ode to that, I guess, honor that journey, like that journey that me and my family take, and the journey that they had to take for me to get here. Yeah, so I came up with the title, and then I changed the name of a lot of the poems to kind of like match the title and to kind of bring the collection together. And I think the movement within those titles, yeah, I think because this book is a lot about travel and like thinking about departure as not just like when you depart somewhere, you're like, when you depart somewhere, you're like always, well, sorry, I feel like I'm getting a little bit like philosophical maybe, but like
Let's go philosophical.
where it feels like you're departing to go somewhere, but then when you get to that place, you're like departing to leave somewhere else, even if that's not like for a while. But just thinking about how life is kind of like always in a state, like you're always kind of moving in some way. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be like forwards, it could also be back. Which I think, so it's like travel on the one level, but also kind of like a self journey, the journey of the self, going through these different stages of growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even thinking too of, going back into memory or going back into those past selves and sort of that movement, emotional states. Yeah, I think that's really,
Yeah.
we love the philosophical moments on the craft chats. So this will be one I go back to for sure. Let me take a peek into the chat because I know things have been coming in all over. There's a couple questions about poets that you read. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like your poetic influences and maybe in direct relation to this book in particular, but also just kind of overarching poets that you find yourself returning to.
So for this book in particular, one poem for this book, plus like I love his work, is Chen Chen. And the way he writes with such like playfulness is something that I'm always kind of striving for. I think I was also reading Natasha Trethewey, kind of like blew my mind. I was like, this is amazing. This is how I want to write. Yeah. Also, I was reading Emily Jungmin Yoon. Her collection is really excellent. Some other writers I really admire, I guess Sylvia Plath also influenced this collection. There's a poem that takes a line from her poem Tulips. I love the work of Ocean Vuong. Yeah, trying to think of more people.
No, that's great. A great reading list for everyone in the audience too. And I think, if I'm thinking correct, I think we have a craft chat in the fall with Chen Chen. So that's something to look forward to.
I will be there. I'm marking my calendar.
But yeah, no, that's awesome. And I love just hearing about maybe poets that you were spending time with across the creation of these poems, because then you start to think through like, oh, okay, there's maybe not always similar style, but similar themes or similar moments or tensions. And I think that speaks to that sort of larger conversation that we enter as poets, where we're sort of building on the influence of those who came before, similar to what we were talking about with using form and things like that too. So that's great. And did you find in grad school that you had time to sort of dedicate to those poets that you found yourself drawn to, or was it difficult to sort of balance that and the pressures of everything else?
That's a good question. I think, yeah, I actually don't think, I think I say Mm. I think I was able to reach for them when I really needed them.
Mm.
Like I would look on my shelf and be like, I really need some Chen Chen in my life today. Just grab and like read a few poems. But yeah, a lot of the time there's a lot of reading in grad school. So it was also hard. And I feel like my eyes get tired easily. So yeah.
Yeah, and sort of that striking the balance. I mean, even now, maybe in post grad school, or if you aren't in grad school or don't want to be in grad school, but sort of finding the balance between like what you feel like you need to do versus what like your artistic self needs is very difficult. And maybe that's kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of the chat too, sort of how to work through those challenging moments and that burnout. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just sort of coming back to the page after this first book has come out, and sort of, you know, how you are navigating that space of creativity, maybe after like the big exhale of the book release and in the reception, and now it's like, okay, now what do I do? Could you just talk a little bit about that sort of space that you're in now?
Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm still maybe exhaling a little bit. I get I was reading, or I am kind of still reading Body Work by Melissa Febos, which is it's kind of like a craft essay, nonfiction memoir type book about writing about the body and like intimacy and sex in a way that's empowering. So I've been really enjoying that, and it kind of like sparks some inspiration for me. But a lot of the writing has been, I have an idea to write about this. And so it's like a list of my ideas, and then like also a document that's like reasons I'm scared to write. Like these are the reasons why it's hard for me to write right now. And like kind of just like talking myself through that. I'm a big journaler. So doing a lot of like hand journaling and like type journaling has been helpful. And then I think also like channeling my creativity in different ways, which is why I've enjoyed like gardening. I guess gardening is the main one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. And it's not always something that we touch upon in the craft chats, but I think, you know, thinking through the poet as like a whole being, right? Not just the poems on the page, but how to nurture your creative self in ways that maybe aren't reading and writing poetry per se, but these other life experiences that end up in the work anyways and are important to it.
Yeah. And I think it's been difficult because I think for a long time in my life, I was like, I have something I really want to say. And like, I know exactly what I want to write. And this is maybe like the first time where it's kind of like silence. Like, I don't know what I want to write. And maybe I just don't have anything I need to or want to say right now. And I think that's okay too, or at least I'm trying to like be grace, like give myself some grace. Like I don't always have to be talking. I can listen. I'm a good listener. I'm usually listening, but yeah.
Just not today.
Yeah.
That would be interesting if we were just asking questions to each other, but no one was answering them. Sort of like
Yeah.
the anti-craft chat.
It'd be very performance art like.
The poet is in, right? No, I think that's helpful too, is just thinking through like giving yourself space and thinking through what to say, and maybe not putting so much pressure on everything that is created. Like not everything has to be something. I think that's something I'm always trying to tell myself, like every draft doesn't have to turn into the best poem I've ever written, right? And it definitely won't, but I think sort of reminding myself that it can do its thing. Nobody ever has to see it, but if someone does get to see it at some point, then great. But sort of alleviating that pressure buildup on the front end can lead to some creativity on the back end too.
Yeah, definitely.
There's an earlier question from Serena about reading poems aloud, and I wonder if you could just talk about like how you choose which poems to read from, or does it change like when you spend some time away from the collection and then go back to it? Are you like, oh, I'm kind of over that poem now? Like how does your attitude change towards your own work and sharing it aloud?
Yeah. I think I feel maybe a little bit guilty saying this, but I have like a few poems in here that I just love to read, that I feel like one of them was How to Love a Rock. I just enjoy reading that poem. And another one would probably be Poem for Giving Birth, because that one the sounds, and it's kind of like a tongue twister, so it's like a challenge to myself. But yeah, I think it's usually like sometimes I do plan in advance, to if I'm reading more poems to try to like get kind of an arc, and to sample a few poems from each section, and to kind of tell a story. And it's also fun because like the poems sit in this book, they're sitting next to they're sitting next to certain poems. But when I read them out loud, I kind of like to, there's a chance for me to read them not in this order. And so I think the meaning can change, or like different things can kind of get like, I don't know the word, but can kind of light up, I guess,
Yeah.
that where they might not in the book. So I think I enjoy kind of like finding those different like connections, and seeing the poem in a different way by doing that. And then, but I also kind of go off feeling like, oh, I'm feeling this poem today, or it feels like a good day to read this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like listening to an album straight through and then like putting it on shuffle and seeing what happens. And yeah, I've never actually thought about it that way, but I really like that sort of opening of possibility when you're reading your work, and sort of keeping that excitement going for you on your end too, because you've spent so much time with the poems already. It's like, oh, here we go. Like we're going back into it. But I think those little moments of excitement, those seem really fun and interesting and surprising as well. Since you mentioned the ode to giving, poem for giving birth, I did want to talk about sounds a little bit, and you're welcome to read the poem if you want to. I don't want to put you on the spot in the middle of the chat, but that one in particular, as you were saying, is so hyper focused on this sort of tongue twisty sounds. But then of course there's great moments of repetition and rhyme and sound use throughout. So I wonder if you could just talk about your approach to that aspect of the poems, and do you read aloud as you write and as you draft, or as you're putting together the collection, or where did those sounds come in your sort of creative process?
Yeah. I think, well, for Poem for Giving Birth, I think I was like in class, and I realized that like, sometimes you're like, to like affirm what someone says, and I do that often. And so I was just like thinking about the sound of the letter M, and how it's just like, it's like this humming that I really enjoy. And so I started to like write down all these words that start with M, uh, which is how the poem got started, and putting them together in a way. And so that was a fun process. It was like a project that I hyper fixated on for like a few days and would think about it when I was walking onto campus and stuff. But I think when I'm writing, usually I think sound kind of comes as a surprise to me, or maybe like it comes like naturally or something, because I'll write a poem and then I'll read it back to myself and I'll notice there's a lot of like slant rhyme or like direct rhyme, rhyme. I don't know terms, I don't know. And I'm like, oh, I didn't do that on purpose, but it's kind of cool that it's there. And then if I see that there, sometimes I'll try to like play off of it a little bit more, or just let it kind of be there. Yeah, but I think sound, yeah, I really enjoy sound aspects of poetry, and reading them out loud can definitely bring them to life in a way that's not the same on the page.
Right. Yeah. It's very different to sort of visually make your way through poem for giving birth and sort of hit those M's internally. But then when you hit it out loud and sort of, I definitely did like a reading to myself because I was like, oh, this is like really fun. And it really does get into a sort of cadence, and it's that sort of tactile in the body living that poetry can do when it's read aloud that I really loved. So I'm glad we got to talk about that one. Love it. I wanted to go back to a question from Beth, which I think is a fun one. What do you love most about your poetry, in both maybe the writing of it and what ends up on the page?
Oh. Wow, that's such an interesting question. Yeah, what do I enjoy the most? I think I think in writing it, I get a lot of enjoyment out of line breaks and creating line breaks, because I think there's an element of surprise that can come from that. Because sometimes I start writing as prose block and then I'll break it and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But then sometimes it leads me to like playing with lines for like hours on end. And I'm like, okay, I need to stop now. Like this is no longer productive. But yeah, I think, yeah, I also think editing is one of my favorite parts of the writing process, because it feels very like there's just so much possibility, but it also feels very like productive. Yeah.
When you go back to poems for that like revising and editing, are you more of like a tinkerer, or do you do like full scale restructurings, rewrites, or I mean, it can be a blend of both, but I know I'm more of a tinkerer myself because I really like agonize over the words as they come out. So then I'm like, let me just move a comma, or, I do like that little stuff and call it revising. But I wonder what your approach is to this.
Yeah, I think I'm also a tinker. I'll like tinker for forever. But I think for some poems, I definitely do like what people might call like radical revision, which I think it's like with the poem Drift, it wasn't working, or just something was off about it. I was like, okay, this needs to be like radically revised. Yeah, which I think it can be, I think those kinds of revisions are fun, but they're also scary because it feels kind of like, oh, I don't want to lose this other, like this original that I've been tinkering with for a long time.
Yeah, I definitely have. Well, I never used to do this. I think when I was first starting out, I would be like, if I'm deleting it now, I don't want it. And then I got kind of overly precious and I was like, no, like I have to save everything. So now my drafts, I just start a new page and I like copy and paste and then do my tinkering and then do it again. So I'll have like, I don't know, 10 pages of the same ish poem, but with different iterations of it. So I feel not so sad when I like lose something.
Yeah, I do that too. It's like the perfect solution.
Yes, yeah, and then you can always scroll up and be like, oh, I liked what past me was doing, like let me go back to that version. Shaheen is asking, do you write by hand on paper or directly into a computer, mix of both? I mean, I know we talked about the Notes app too, so that's a good sort of on the move function, but
Yeah, I think I mostly do typing. Sometimes I'll do like handwriting, but I think those are like, I don't do it too often. It has to be like a special moment, I think. Um, yeah.
yeah, I feel like nowadays it's maybe just more convenient. Like if I'm already at the computer, I'll just have another document up, or the Notes app is like full of fragments for me. I'm like, oh, this would be an interesting line that I don't have a home for yet, but it can live here, and then maybe it'll it'll find its home at some point.
Yeah, I have so many fragments on my Notes app, but they're kind of just like, I don't ever look at them. So I'm like, I'll come back to this, and then I never come back to it.
Yeah, sometimes going back to it has that horrible moment where you're like, ooh, I thought this was good. What was I thinking? Like, this isn't, no. Is that my grocery list? Like, what are we doing here? But sometimes it's like, maybe I can just submit this whole thing and call it fragments and see what it's doing. Take it or leave it. I did want to talk a little bit before we have to wrap up just about your path to publishing and sort of how this book came about, the winner of the Ballard Spar Prize for poetry, which is amazing and put out by Milkweed. So obviously congratulations on that. But I just wonder if you could talk about sort of navigating the poetry publishing world with your first book.
Yeah. Do you mean like before, like sending it out, or kind of?
Yeah, I guess just how did you decide where to send it, and that sort of thought process of the publishing slog, but also thinking through the contests and the different prizes and things like that.
Yeah. So when I was choosing what to submit to, I really looked at presses that publish books that I really enjoy reading. So of course Milkweed, and then I think I submitted to like Four Way Books, Grey Wolf, Yes Yes Books. Yeah, I don't remember. But yeah, that's mainly how I decided to choose. And so I would look at their websites and see what contests they had. And then if they had like a debut poets contest, which I think I was mainly looking at. Yeah. I would sometimes also look at judges, which I've heard that it's not like always great to do it in that way, because the judge's preference might not match the press in the end. So it can be, so then when your book is actually with the press, it might be a little bit more difficult in other aspects, or not like matched up in other aspects. But I would look at judges and people who might enjoy my work. But I've also heard that like what a poet, right? Sorry, that's cat playing in the kennel. I've also heard that like like I was basing it off of like poems that I read from that judge, but also kind of like sometimes what you read of a poet is not necessarily what they might like to read themselves. So it's kind of like, well, it's all a guessing game, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I kind of also I submitted to a lot of contests that didn't or I tried to, that didn't have a submission fee, which is great if you can find, because it can really add up after a while.
Yes, yeah, it is definitely one of those things where a lot of research and sort of keeping a list of who's opening when, who doesn't charge, who has like good distribution. You know, there's so many things where you want, on one hand, you want your work out there, but on the other hand, you have all these other concerns, right? Which are justifiable concerns because this is your work and you need it to be in careful hands. So, but yeah, I think that those are all really good things to think about. Who's reading the work, who's editing the work, and do you like the design of the books that come from that press? Do you like the authors they publish, what they stand for? There's so many considerations to come into play too.
Yeah.
But yeah, love Milkweed and obviously love this book. It's gorgeous. Our last question, which is like the saddest part, having to end the chats, but I just wondered if you had any go-to craft advice or a craft book that you find yourself returning to, anything to leave our audience with tonight.
Oh. Do you say books that I'm returning to?
Yeah, like any sort of books on craft, or maybe tangentially related to craft, or just sort of a piece of advice that lives with you.
I think so. Grey Wolf has like a series called The Art of Blank. I don't have my books here, so I can't like look at which ones I have that were useful, but it's such a great series. So they'll get like a writer to write about something like revision or line, or like even some fiction things like dialogue. Yeah, so that series is great. If you're into writing fiction, I've been reading Craft in the Real World by Michael Salesses. And then if you're also thinking about writing about body, intimacy, sex, I would definitely recommend Body Work by Melissa Febos. Just like a lot of great thoughts about, I mean, not even just like, I feel like it's a craft book. I feel like a lot of craft books are craft books that can be applied to like real life living in the world type thinking.
Yeah, we love that. I'm just looking on my bookshelf over here because I have one of those art ofs, but I don't know, I can't read which one. Oh, The Poetic Line. So yes, love that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one.
And they're great. They're like kind of small and compact and easily carried around in a satchel or something. So yeah, I love that series. Well, sadly, that is our time today. Jennifer, thank you so much for just being so open to answering all of our questions and diving into your amazing book, Return Flight. Please, if you don't have a copy, buy a copy. Link will be coming back into the chat, or bug your local independent bookseller to order you a copy. And thank you to all of our guests for all of your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but thank you for being here and spending your Thursday night with us.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for being here. And thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Zach.